The Torah portion for this week is Mikeitz, and it means at the end. It's found in Genesis chapter 41, verse 1 through chapter 44, verse 17. The Haftarah portion is Zechariah chapter 2:14, and up to chapter 4, verse 7. The Brit Hadashah New Testament portion is Luke 24, verse 13 through 29. And first we'll talk a little bit about Hanukkah. You'll see that over here, there's a Hanukkah lid. It has a place for 9 candles. The center candle is the Shamash. And each day of Hanukkah, one more candle is added. This is the third night. Hanukkah started on Sunday night. But how did we get to this place? And so far in the Torah, right, we talked about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And now we're getting into the 12 children of Jacob and Joseph. And shortly after this, everybody goes down to Egypt, right? And they're in captivity in Egypt for a certain length of time. And Moses brings them out. And we go through the Judges period. And then we come to the time of the kings, and we have Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. So we have the United Kingdom of Israel with all of the tribes. And then in the time of Solomon's sons, what happens? It divides up into the 10 tribes of Israel and the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin, right?
Did they have a civil war or something?
Right. And then the Assyrians come. The Assyrians come in 722 BCE, and they take the 10 tribes into captivity, right? And that's what a lot of people know as the 10 lost tribes, right? And then we come down to 606 BC, and that's when the Babylonians come in with Nebuchadnezzar, and the tribes of Judah and Benjamin go into captivity in Babylon for 70 years, right? And then the Medes and the Persians defeat the Babylonians, and eventually Cyrus comes out with the decree, right, that the children of Israel can go back to the land and rebuild the temple, and a remnant of the Jewish people goes back to Israel. That's in about 536 BC. And so for a while the Persians are in control, and then the Greeks come in under Alexander the Great. And he conquers all these lands in the Middle East there, and he establishes Hellenism. Okay, we all know about Hellenism. They come out with their Greek thinking and all about the body and pleasure and the physical things of the world and beauty, right? Worshiping beauty and man and wisdom and knowledge, the things of the world instead of the things of God. And after Alexander dies, his generals take over. The kingdom is split up into different sections, and the general in charge of the part where the children of Israel are is a man named Antiochus. Okay, and Antiochus comes in, and instead of using the laissez-faire policy of Alexander the Great, Alexander the Great's idea was to come in and be benevolent and kind of just assimilate everybody. And so he assimilated a bunch of the Jewish people into Hellenism, and as those groups of people were assimilated into Hellenism, later on those people, it says, in some of the studies I've read, says that the ones that got absorbed into Hellenism later on became actually the Sadducees.
Oh, yes.
The Sadducees. which were actually more involved with the things of the world.
Yeah,
They didn't believe in life after death
yeah,
for the world
yeah,
to
that's
come.
amazing.
They just believed in the things of the world, and that was as a result of Hellenism.
Yeah. It's kind of
Okay.
what we call
And so finally it comes down to the point where a Jewish man is being forced, according to the history, was being forced to sacrifice a pig.
Yeah,
And one of the priests, Mattathias, was outraged by it and killed the Jewish man. And he says, whoever is for the Jewish people and for the Lord, follow me. And he went with his sons, and many, many Jewish people joined with him. And eventually, in 167 BCE, they defeated Antiochus, and they rededicated the temple, right? So we had Mattathias, and we have Judah the Maccabee. The word Maccabee means hammer,
hammer, yeah,
hammer.
yeah, hammer.
And over overwhelming odds, they won the victory. And according to the traditions, when they went into the temple, they only had enough oil to light the menorah for one day. But after they cleansed the temple, remember now, Antiochus sacrificed pigs on the altar and had a statue of Zeus in the temple. And so the Maccabees, with all the other Jewish people, they went in, they cleansed the temple, they reinstituted temple worship, and because the Hanukkah menorah, and well, actually the menorah in the temple had the 7 branches,
Yeah,
burned for 8 days.
They still
Later
don't.
on, they came out with the Hanukkah to represent the 8 days.
okay, they still, you call either one a
Right.
menorah, but this is.
Right, this is a Hanukkah. The menorah has 7 branches, the
Yeah.
shamash with 3 on each side. The Hanukkah has 9, the shamash with 4 on each
How come
side.
it has 9 now?
Because it lasted 8 days.
Oh, okay, it
It's for
burned right
use.
They
there.
celebrated
Yeah,
for
yeah.
8 days.
Oh, okay.
And
Okay.
basically the problem was, they said that they only had enough oil for one day, and to get fresh oil, they had to send people to Mount Ephraim to process the olive oil and bring it back, and to follow all of the procedures to get proper oil for the lighting of the menorah in the temple. The whole process took a total of 8 days. You know, like for the people to go to the area to harvest the olives,
Yeah.
to get the oil,
They keep
and
it-
fulfill all the
they keep
requirements.
that burning all the time, night and day?
Yeah, the menorah was burning all the time,
Huh.
okay? And then because of the what they had, because of the persecution of Antiochus and his soldiers, what the Jewish people would do to study Torah, they would have things called dreidels, okay? And each letter on the dreidel represented a different word. You had a letter Nun, and a letter Gimel, and a letter Shin, and a letter He. And the letter Nun represented the word Nes, which meant a miracle. And the Gimel represented the word Gadol, which meant great. And the word Hayah means happened, and the word Sham for the Shin means there. Okay? So anybody that lives outside of Israel would be Nes Gadol Hayah Sham, which means a great miracle happened there in the land of Israel. And if you're in Israel, it's Nes Gadol Hayah Sham, a great miracle happened, no, Nes Gadol Hayah Po, which means a great miracle happened here. And that's for the people in Israel. So that's where the dreidel comes from. So they'd be playing the dreidel game while they were studying Torah to try and fake out the Greek soldiers. And so whenever the soldiers would come, they'd be playing this game.
Oh, man.
And what the Greeks did was they wouldn't allow anybody to study the Torah. They wouldn't allow anybody to be circumcised.
Yeah. Oh,
And they wouldn't allow anybody to keep kosher. They had to sacrifice pigs and eat pork. And finally, Mattathias got to the point where he was totally just outraged, and they began guerrilla warfare against the Greeks, and eventually they overcame the forces of Antiochus and cleansed the temple and reclaimed it.
but, you know, the Romans were very similar. They
Right.
wouldn't let them, they couldn't speak
Right.
the name of,
Right.
the holy,
And
the
so,
holy name.
and so after the Maccabees, everything was reestablished for a short period of time. And then later on, the Romans come in
They wouldn't
and
let them
conquer everything and destroy the temple. And that's coming into the time that Yeshua lived in, right? At the
Yeah.
time of Yeshua HaMashiach, the temple still existed.
Mhm.
And then after he was crucified in 78, okay, after about 40 years after Yeshua was crucified, the temple was destroyed,
He told the disciples it was going to be
Right.
destroyed.
and Yeshua revealed all that in the prophecy. Now you'll find that in the Tanakh, there is absolutely no mention of Hanukkah, because Hanukkah didn't take place until after the whole Tanakh was written.
Yeah.
It also,
This is not like the others where feasts were,
right,
they were ordered by God to be
right,
observed
this
forever.
comes later on,
Observed forever.
but Hanukkah is mentioned in the book of First and Second Maccabees, and I believe in another book,
John chapter 10.
Esdras, huh?
John chapter 10.
And in John chapter 10. So we'll go to John chapter 10 right now, because basically Hanukkah is all about being the light, and it represents the light of the Torah going forth from Jerusalem, the word of Torah going forth. Yeshua is the Torah made flesh, according to John chapter 1. But in John chapter 10, it tells us this about Yeshua. John chapter 10,
Verse 22.
starting at verse 22, says this: At that time, the feast of the dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Yeshua was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. The Jews therefore gathered around him and were saying to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." And then Yeshua answers them, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, these bear witness of me, but you do not believe because you are not of my sheep. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me, and I give eternal life to them, and they shall never perish, and no one shall snatch them out of my hand. My Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of my Father's hand. I and my Father are one." The Jews therefore took up stones again to stone him. Yeshua answered them, "I showed you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you stoning me?" The Jews answered him, "For a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself out to be God."
Yeah. Well,
And-
the
okay.
people thought he was gonna liberate them from the Romans, right? So he's gonna be king, in other words,
Okay, verse 37. Verse 30, okay, it goes on. Yeshua answered them, has it not been written in your law, I said to you, you are gods? If he called them gods to whom the word of God came and the scripture cannot be broken, do you say of him whom the Father sanctified and sent into the world, you are blaspheming because I said, I am the Son of God? And you notice in verse 36 he says, do you say of him whom the Father sanctified and sent into the world? Right there, Yeshua is saying that he was sanctified by the Father and sent into the world, right?
Set apart.
It says, I am the Son of God. If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me. But if I do them, though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I in the Father. Okay, it goes on. Therefore they were seeking again to seize him, and he eluded their grasp. He went away again beyond the Jordan to the place where John was first baptizing, and he was staying there. And then he came to him and were saying, while John performed no sign, yet everything John said about this man was true, and many believed in him there. So it says right there that many of the Jewish people at that time believed in Yeshua, that Yeshua was the Messiah,
Yeah.
Yeshua HaMashiach.
There was a remnant throughout the land. I mean, people
Right.
that saw miracles, they didn't believe he was a magician like most people. They thought he was
Okay,
the
and
son of
so,
God.
and so here, Yeshua is in Jerusalem. He's at the Feast of Dedication. The word Hanukkah means dedication. And on the Jewish calendar, this happens on the 25th of Kislev, which began Sunday night.
I wonder if that's another deal where the Pope decided to overrun that with Christmas and all
Yeah.
that stuff.
Well, they don't always occur. This year, what happened is, actually, this is the third day of Hanukkah, so Christmas occurs just about right in the middle of the celebration of Hanukkah. And right here you can see, Yeshua is at the Feast of Dedication. He's at the Hanukkah feast in Jerusalem. That's what the Feast of Dedication is. And there are other things that happened in the history of Israel on the 25th of Kislev also, and you can look that up. And if you want to study a little bit about the history on Hanukkah, you can read 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Okay? And so now we'll get into this Torah portion. As we said, Mikeitz means at the end. And we start with the letter Mayim, okay? Besides being what? Besides Yeshua being the light of the world, he's the living water, right? So Mikeitz starts with the letter Mem, water, chaos, mighty, or blood, and it's the number 40, which refers to the time of testing and trial. Okay, and in this Torah portion, we'll study about Joseph and all of the things that Joseph is going through. Okay, testing and trial. Okay, remember the flood, the time of Noah, 40 days and 40 nights,
Does 40 mean judgment also? Seemed like I heard that.
kind of a judgment. 40 is also, Moses fasted 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai twice. Okay, Yeshua fasted 40 days and 40 nights when he was tempted of the adversary. Also, he ascended into heaven, 40 days after he was resurrected from the Mount of Olives, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of 40s in the Bible. And then,
I always wondered what that meant.
Okay. we have 40. Okay, next we have Kuf. the sun at the horizon, the rising sun or a setting sun, circle time condensed, the number 100. And the number 100 means to surround or great strength. Okay, circle, surround, or great strength. And the letter Sadi, in this case, you could have a final Sadi, means the side of a man, wait, chase, snare, or hunt. The number 90, which would be 9 times 10. So the 9 would be finality and judgment. The 10 would represent the 10 words, 10 statements of creation, the 10 words on Mount Sinai, 10 men in a minion, means hand or thrust. And we see that the gematria adds up to 230, which is the word panak, to indulge, pamper, to treat delicately. Well, that's just the opposite of what happens to Joseph, right? But what happens to Benjamin?
He treats him that way.
He treats Benjamin this way in this Torah portion, right? And so we have the 0, what is hidden, or eternity.
Yeah, 0.
And in this Torah portion, and in the previous Torah portion, Joseph reveals what is hidden. We have the number 2 for divide, or light and darkness, or the 2 tablets of the 10 words. We have 3 for revelation, or the Father, the Son, the Spirit, the Torah, the writings, and the prophets. We have 5 for grace and for power. And right in here, you'll see Yeshua. Okay? Yeshua is what? The mighty one of Jacob. He shed his blood for the forgiveness of our sins on the tree of sacrifice. He's what? He sits on the circle of the earth. He's over all time. He's strong, according to the number 100, right? Sadi. The letter Sadi is the first letter of Zadik, the righteous man. Means wait, chase, snare, or hunt. What happened with Yeshua? He celebrated the Passover with his disciples. Then they went out to the Mount of Olives, right? To pray. And what happened? Judas betrayed him, sold him out to the temple authorities. They hunted him. They brought him in, they tried him, they brought him to Pilate. He went to Herod and back and forth. Finally, he was crucified, right? So you see a picture of Yeshua right in the pictograms. And actually, there are many parallels between Yeshua and Joseph. Okay? Yeshua came to his brothers, right? Joseph went to, okay, what happened? Yeshua's brothers attacked him, right? Joseph's brothers attacked him. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, right? What happened to Yeshua? He was sold out by Judas, right? Joseph was thrown into a pit to be left for dead. Yeshua was put in the grave. Joseph was taken out of the pit. Yeshua was resurrected from the tomb. Okay, Joseph rose what? To a position of authority over the whole land of Egypt. And Yeshua was resurrected from the dead and raised up, right, to the right hand of God the Father to rule over everything, right? Yeshua has the name above every other name. That what? At the name of Yeshua, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess to the glory of God the Father, right?
Yeah.
In heaven, on earth, under the earth, everywhere, right? So there's parallels between Joseph and Yeshua, and there's even more than that. There's several I can share here also between Joseph and Yeshua, okay, both came to see their brothers, both were plotted against by their brothers. They were both sold for pieces of silver, both stripped of their robes, both of them were put in a pit. A meal was eaten after each one of them was disposed of. The pit was empty when Reuben went back. The tomb was empty when the disciples went back. Joseph was put into the hands of the Gentiles, and Yeshua was put into the hands of the Gentiles, the Romans, to be crucified for the salvation of the whole world. Okay, so there's a lot of parallels between Joseph and Yeshua.
Where did they get that there's similarities between him and David? No, I can't think.
There may be some, but we'll get to that later.
Maybe he's just,
So now we'll go into this Torah portion. And actually, we need to go back a little bit. The last Torah portion, we didn't get a chance to finish it, but in that Torah portion, Joseph interprets the dreams of the butler and the baker, right? And the butler was the one that served the wine to Pharaoh, and the baker was the one responsible for baking the bread, and he was responsible for all of the bread that was served to the Pharaoh. And what happened was, supposedly they found a stone in the bread, and the baker was held guilty of that. And so the baker has the dream, he tells it to Joseph in the prison, and he tells the baker, in 3 days, you're gonna be killed, put to death by the Pharaoh. And a fly was found in the cup of wine. And so they were gonna hold the butler accountable for that, but a fly could fly in at any time from anywhere.
yeah. they didn't
So
have
that's not a
windows and
plot.
screens and stuff.
So that's not a plot to try and kill the Pharaoh. And so Joseph interpreted the dream for the Pharaoh, for the butler, that the butler would come back to the Pharaoh and he would again press the grapes and serve wine to Pharaoh, which he did. And in the prison, okay, remember Joseph ran away, right? His robe was torn off by Potiphar's wife, right?
Yep.
Zuleika. And Joseph escaped, they had their trial, and to save face, Potiphar had Joseph put in the prison. In the prison, Joseph worked real hard, showed the light of the Torah in the prison, right? And everything in the prison was put under Joseph's hand. The butler and the baker were having some issues because they had these dreams. So Joseph resolved that issue for them. But he was put in a place of authority in the prison. They say that Joseph spent 12 years in that prison. And they say that 10 of the years he spent in that prison were for Lashon Hara, for evil speech, because they say that when he went to his father and spoke to his father about his brothers, that he wasn't fair, that he didn't relate the situation to Jacob about his brothers properly, because he didn't provide all of the information. He made a misjudgment. And so for that, they say, for speaking Lashon Hara against his brothers, he served 1 year in prison for the Lashon Hara that he spoke against each one of his 10 brothers. And then he spent another 2 years in the prison for asking the butler to remember him before Pharaoh. For 2 words, remember me. Instead of depending on the Lord to resolve the situation and bring him out of the prison. So it was 1 year for Lashon Hara against each one of his 10 brothers, and 2 years for expecting man to deliver him out of the prison instead of the Lord.
You said this stuff was in the Midrash?
Yeah, that's in the Midrash.
Yeah.
And so Joseph was held accountable for every one of his actions and suffered consequences for everything that he did. And he paid the price for the things that he did.
You said the baker, though, he got executed?
The baker got executed.
I guess the king could have broke a tooth on that rock.
Yeah. And some say that's
That'd be
probably
serious.
what happened, so he was really angry.
Oh, yeah, that's very possible.
Well, how else would he find the stone in the bread, right?
Well, that's right.
So it's quite possible the Pharaoh might have chomped into it and said, "Get that baker."
Ooh.
And so,
Man, if I was a baker, I'd want to watch that bread dough real close.
Yeah. Sift well,
huh?
sift well.
So we're gonna come to Genesis chapter 41. And this all took place, this was all timed according to the judgment that the Lord placed on Joseph for what he did. In other words, Joseph suffered those consequences, and the Lord would not release him from that prison until he had paid the consequences of what he did. And right to the day, he comes out of the prison. And they say that the day, according to the Midrashes, they say that the day Joseph comes out of the prison and stands before Pharaoh is Rosh Hashanah. So I'll have Debbie start reading. So Debbie, could you go ahead and read? And they say actually that the Pharaoh had these dreams in the Midrash constantly for a couple of years.
I thought they let him out of prison because he interpreted the king's dreams.
Yeah. Eventually that's what happens. But the Pharaoh was constantly having these dreams, and finally it's getting to the point where Pharaoh's about to go crazy, can't stand it anymore, and he calls for all his people to interpret the dream, and that's where we're going to go here. So Debbie, Genesis 41, verse 1 through verse 8.
And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored cows, and fat-fleshed. They fed in the meadow. And behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ill-favored, lean-fleshed, and stood by the other cows upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed cows did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke, and he slept and dreamed the second time, and behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And it came to pass in the morning that the spirit was troubled. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told him his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh.
Okay. So now, Pharaoh's been having this dream, and what happens is he remembers the first part of the dream, but he can't remember the interpretation of the dream. They say he knows it, but it's in the back of his mind, so that when somebody gives him the true interpretation, he'll know that it's right. And so he summons,
What it was.
and so he summons all the necromancers, the magicians, soothsayers and all of these different people to come before him. And what is the Lord doing? Well, the Lord is making sure that Joseph is the last person to show up. Why? Because the Lord wants to make sure that after Joseph gives the interpretation, that nobody can say, hey, I had a chance to give that interpretation, but I didn't get a turn. Right? So he's making sure that everybody gets a shot at it, so they can't come back later and say, wow, that's what I would have said.
Yeah, I never thought about that.
Right? And so all of the magicians of Egypt and the sorcerers, soothsayers, necromancers, every single one of them has to go first before Joseph shows up, so that they have no excuse.
Yeah, good idea.
Okay? And they say what Pharaoh would do was that because Pharaoh knew the dream, he would quiz these magicians and sorcerers that came to him by leaving out parts of his dream, leaving out some of the information or adding in something different to see if the person that was going to interpret his dream really knew what his dream was and what the interpretation was. And so he tested each sorcerer, each magician individually, one at a time, and none of them passed the test of the Pharaoh. And so finally, remember now, this butler's forgotten about Joseph for 2 years. Every day for 2 years he's forgotten about Joseph. So finally now, since Joseph has served his time on the Lord's calendar, now the butler's allowed to remember and tell Pharaoh. Okay, finally now, say in the Midrash, it says that the butler tried everything he could do to remember to tell Pharaoh about Joseph, and every time he went to tell Pharaoh about Joseph, he couldn't remember. You know, something would always come up and distract him or whatever, and he never got to tell Pharaoh about Joseph for 2 years.
Oh my goodness.
And it was all part of God's plan, so that Joseph would come out at the proper time, so that it would just be 7 years of plenty before the famine hit. So everything was a part, right? The Lord knows the end from the beginning. It was every single day, every single minute was all planned out by the Lord. And so it says there in verse 8, no one could interpret the dream for Pharaoh. That means correctly interpret it. Okay? And so now we'll have Angela read verse 9 through verse 15.
Then the chamberlain of the cupbearers spoke up before Pharaoh. My transgressions do I mention today. Pharaoh had become incensed at his servants and placed me in the ward of the house of the chamberlain of the butchers, me and the chamberlain of the bakers. We dreamt a dream on the same night, I and he, each one according to the interpretation of his dream did we dream. And there with us was a Hebrew youth, a slave of the chamberlain of the butchers. We related it to him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. He interpreted for each in accordance with his dream. And it was just as he interpreted it for us, so did it happen. And he restored to my me restored to my post, and him he hanged.
Okay.
So Pharaoh sent and summoned Joseph, and they rushed him from the dungeon. He shaved and changed his clothes, and he came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I dreamt a dream, but no one can interpret it. Now, I heard it said of you that you comprehend a dream to interpret it.
Okay, so we'll stop here. So now, the butler knows, and all of the people know, that whoever interprets Pharaoh's dream is going to be highly favored and put in a position of authority in Egypt, right?
Mhm.
And so the butler makes sure to disparage Joseph, even while he's telling the Pharaoh that Joseph can interpret the dreams. He disparages Joseph as much as he can to show that Joseph, even if he interprets the dream, does not rise to the level of somebody that can be put in a position of authority in Egypt. Okay? So the butler starts out, he is a Hebrew youth.
Starts
Right,
with all
so-
the
so
negative.
He's a youth. He's a Hebrew. One of those detestable people that sacrifices our gods and eats them. He's a slave of the chamberlain of the butchers.
It's kind of like the Muslims talk about the Israelis.
Okay,
They
so
drink
so
blood
so right
and kill
away,
people.
so right away he's trying to downplay and say all of these negative things about Joseph, so that Joseph can't have a position of authority. Okay? So even though he's telling Pharaoh about it, the reason is this. He knows that if the Pharaoh's dream isn't interpreted, that the Pharaoh's gonna lose it.
Yes.
And if there's another Pharaoh, the butler says, if there's a new Pharaoh, I may not have a job.
Hmm.
I may not have my wonderful position, I might lose it. And so I have to make sure I keep Pharaoh in good shape, right?
Looking out for number one.
Yep. Well, he's not looking out for Pharaoh, he's looking out for his
For himself,
position,
yeah.
for his
Most people
position.
do.
Okay, so that's where the butler is coming from. He's looking out for number one.
Right.
And to look out for number one, he has to look out for the Pharaoh, he'll do that. And so Joseph is taken from the dungeon. And they say here actually that during all of this time, that Joseph hasn't cut his hair or drunk wine, shaved or done anything. And some of the people, some of the midrashas say actually that he was following, like later on, what would be called the Nazarite vow.
Oh, yeah. And they didn't eat a lot of Pharaoh's food either,
No.
did they?
Right, and that'll happen later on. And so Joseph comes, he shaves, cuts his hair, has all these fancy clothes put on to come and appear before Pharaoh. So Elmer, could you go ahead and read verse 16 through 24?
Okay. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me, Elohim. It is not in me. Elohim will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And Pharaoh spoke to Joseph in my dream, behold, I stood upon the brink of the river. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 cows, fat-fleshed and well-favored, favored, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ill-favored, and lean flesh, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt, for badness. And the lean and ill-favored cows did eat up the first 7 fat cows, and when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favored, at the beginning. So I woke, and I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up on one stalk, full and good. And behold, 7 ears withered, thin, and blasted with the east wind sprung up after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. And I told it to the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me.
Okay, so here, okay, it says here that the Pharaoh relates his dream to Joseph. And they say in the Midrash that Pharaoh does the same thing to Joseph that he does to all the other people, and that he leaves out parts of the dream or he adds in things that weren't there to test Joseph to see if Joseph really knows what his dream was. And they say that the Pharaoh tests Joseph this way, and every time Pharaoh makes an error in the description of his dream, that Joseph corrects him. And so the Pharaoh knows that in fact Joseph can interpret his dream, because Joseph knows what the whole dream is even before Pharaoh tells him.
Wow, that would be impressive.
Because as Pharaoh goes through describing it, Joseph corrects him whenever he changes part of the story,
Yeah, he's trying to trick him too.
trying to trick him, until he finds out that Joseph is true,
Yeah, yeah. He's a real deal.
that he's the real, that he's, as Elmer said, the real deal. And so now Joseph's been given this description, but in verse 16, what does Joseph say to Pharaoh? Pharaoh asks him to interpret the dream, and what does Joseph say? That is beyond me. It is God who will respond with Pharaoh's welfare.
Amen.
So right here, what is he doing? It's not me, Pharaoh, that's going to interpret your dream for you. It's God.
Right, right. The one true
The
God.
one true God will give you what? Will respond with Pharaoh's welfare. Okay, so he's not claiming, Joseph is not claiming anything for himself. He's not saying he's anybody great or important, right? He's not making any demands. If I interpret this dream, you have to give me this and that and the other thing, right?
Right.
Yeah, like what do I get if I interpret this?
Yeah.
Well, that's what.
Well, if you don't interpret my dream, I'm gonna kill you, right? No.
Yeah.
Well, then nobody will interpret it. You'll go crazy, right? No.
Yeah.
So now we'll get the explanation, and we're back to Debbie. Okay, Genesis 41, verse 25 through 32.
Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God has showed Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing that I have spoken to Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he shows to Pharaoh. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land, and the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. And for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice, is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass.
Okay, so now Joseph interprets the dream for Pharaoh, explains to Pharaoh what the dream means, what it represents, and a way to deal with the situation that's coming, right?
Mhm.
Said 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. Here's how we can take care of this approaching disaster so that everybody can live through it, right? So that everybody can survive the judgment. But what else does, you notice the terms that Joseph uses here? What does he say? Says, the dream of Pharaoh is a single one. So again, he's not saying anything about Joseph, right? What? God is telling Pharaoh what he's about to do, right? Verse 28. It is this matter that I have spoken to Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he has shown to Pharaoh. He's not saying he has shown it to Joseph, to me, right? He's giving all of the accolades to the Pharaoh, right? God showed you the dream and showed you what was going to happen.
He just
He's
didn't
in
know what it
charge.
meant.
Huh?
Yeah, he just didn't know what it meant. Yeah.
Yeah. And so now Joseph explains everything to him. And now he's going to give Pharaoh a recommendation of what to do, right? Verse 33. So Angela, could you read 33 through 40?
Now let Pharaoh seek out a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed, and let him appoint our overseers on the land, and he shall prepare the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. And let them gather all the food of those approaching good years. Let them amass grain under Pharaoh's authority for food in the cities and safeguard it. The food will be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine which will befall the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish in the famine. The matter appeared good in Pharaoh's eyes and in the eyes of his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, could we find another like him, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this, there can be no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and by your command shall all my people be sustained. Only by the throne shall I outrank you.
Okay, so we'll stop there. So, now you have what? All of the officials in Pharaoh's court, right, that have all of these positions of authority. Okay, when Joseph was sold into slavery, he was 17 years old. When he stands before Pharaoh, he's 30 years old, just like Yeshua was 30 years old when he began his ministry. Right? And so Joseph is standing before Pharaoh at the age of 30. He interprets the dream. And Pharaoh selects Joseph to be in charge of all this, right? He says this, only by the throne shall I outrank you, which means he's putting a 30-year-old Hebrew slave in charge of the whole kingdom over all of his officials and all of the people that have authority in his kingdom have to bow down before Joseph. Now remember how the butler disparaged them and everything just a little while back, right? He's a youth. We're all wise old men, right?
He got the dream right.
Yeah. But the Pharaoh is going to appoint him to this position, and then all of the officials go according to the law of Egypt. We can't put a foreigner in charge of the land. What experience does Joseph have ruling over a kingdom? He's been a slave, he's been in prison for 12 years,
I'm like trying to elect a president, no?
right? And so all of the officials in Pharaoh's kingdom are up in arms about this. You can't do this, Pharaoh. What kind of experience does this guy have to rule over everything? Right? So he served in Potiphar's house as a slave. He was in the prison for 12 years.
Yeah,
Give us a break, Pharaoh.
ex-con, I mean.
Give us a break, Pharaoh, right?
No experience.
And so Pharaoh agrees to test Joseph. And so Pharaoh puts everything off, according to the Midrash, Pharaoh puts everything off for a day. And they say in the Midrashes that there were 70 steps that went up to the throne of Pharaoh, and that the land of Egypt made its wealth by trade with other nations. And so your value to the kingdom was based on how many languages you knew, right? Was based on how many languages you knew that would be of benefit to the kingdom of Egypt. As we trade with all these different trading partners, all these different nations of the world. You know, like, how many languages do you know? How many people can you make contracts with, right? To make us more money. Right? Knowing languages was worth something, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so they say that just before Joseph is released from prison, he's taught all of the languages by an angel.
And a lot of languages
So-
are similar.
And so the next day Joseph comes before Pharaoh, and all of the officials of Pharaoh's court, and Pharaoh is going to test Joseph. And so Joseph gets on there's 70 steps up to Pharaoh's throne. And so Joseph gets on the first step, and Pharaoh speaks to him in one language, and Joseph answers him back in that language. And Joseph goes up to the second step, and the Pharaoh asks him a question in another language, and Joseph answers it in that language. And he works his way up, all 70 steps, all the way up to the throne of Pharaoh. And then he speaks to, Pharaoh knows the 70 languages, the languages of the nations, but he doesn't know Hebrew. So Joseph speaks to the Pharaoh in Hebrew, and Pharaoh can't understand it. And Pharaoh's basically saying that, Joseph knows more than I do. Please don't tell anybody that you know more than I do. And this way he justifies, the Pharaoh justifies placing Joseph in a position of authority over the whole land. That's not in scripture, that's just part of the Midrash. That Joseph knows all of the languages so that he can
That would be a
deal
big asset.
with everybody,
Yeah.
okay? And so now, what happens? What verse are we up to? We're up to Elmer.
41.
We're up to 41 and we're up to Elmer, right? So go ahead and read verse 41 through verse 46.
Alright. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand and arrayed him in garments of fine linen. and put a gold chain around his neck, and he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, bow the knee, and he set him over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without you shall no man lift up his hand or his foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name
Zephaniah,
Tanya,
right,
and he gave him a wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On,
right,
and Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. 46.
yep,
Oh, and Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt.
okay, stop there. So now, Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of all the land of Egypt, right? He gives him the ring,
Wow.
puts a gold chain around his neck. He rides in the second chariot, and in the Chumash it says, they proclaim before Joseph Avrek, which means my father the king.
Mhm.
So everybody in the land had to bow down before Joseph and proclaim him as my father the king.
Yeah. Yeah, the Pharaoh's like God, wasn't he? Back in those days.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so Joseph was in charge of all the land of Egypt. It says here in verse 44, without you, no man may lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And that was in reference to the military. And so Joseph was put in charge over the whole military of the land of Egypt. And the purpose of that was that Joseph had to store up all this grain, preserve all this food, and he had to protect all those granaries and make sure that nobody stole anything. All of that grain had to be guarded.
Yeah.
Also, the borders of the land had to be guarded so that during the famine,
Right.
nobody from another nation would invade the land and try and steal the grain that they stored up for the time of the famine.
You know, once the word got out. look
Yeah,
out.
and so Joseph had full authority over the Egyptian army.
Oh, yeah. And they built a lot of extra granaries and stuff. Took a
Yeah.
lot of manpower. He
Yeah.
had to put them military guys
Yeah.
and soldiers to work.
Yep. And so he basically had rule over everything. Okay? Then Pharaoh calls him what in verse 45, Zaphanath Paneah, and that comes back to this. What is hidden? The man who reveals what is hidden. That's what Joseph does. Okay? And it goes on, and this is to make things right. Remember, Joseph was accused of trying to be with Potiphar's wife, right?
Mhm.
And they say that the woman mentioned here is actually the daughter of Potiphar, the chief of On, and his wife. And you remember there was a woman named Zuleika. Her daughter is this woman named Asenath. Now some people say, and this is only according to the legends and the Midrash, and I think sometimes the Jewish people do this to keep everything, that the whole family is Jewish and that there's nobody from outside in here. But we know about Ruth the Moabitess, and we know about other people in the lineage that were from other nations that were converts.
Yeah, they
To the
I guess
one true
anybody
God.
could convert if
Okay.
if they wanted to
So,
live there.
so there's two different theories here. But first off was that because Joseph was accused of trying to be with this man's wife, he was given the daughter to show that there was no
Hard feelings?
hard feelings or animosity,
No animosity, yeah.
and that the accusation against Joseph wasn't really true, because if the accusation was true, the man's daughter wouldn't be given to Joseph as a wife.
Yeah.
And so this was to clear
It's kind of like a
Joseph's
sign.
name. Huh?
Kind of like a sign.
Right. This was to clear Joseph's name.
They kept trying to keep it in the royal
Right.
families. I know they
And
said there was a lot
so
of
he's
inbreeding.
marrying a princess, okay, the daughter of the priest of On. Okay, supposedly this is Zuleika's daughter that she had with Potiphar. Now, there's other people that say that Potiphar was sterile and that he didn't have any children, and that this woman Asenath that's given to Joseph as a wife is actually the daughter of Jacob's wife,
Daughter.
of Jacob's daughter, okay, that Asenath is actually the daughter of Jacob's daughter, Dinah.
Dean.
Okay,
And
remember
Shechem.
Dinah was raped by Shechem, and supposedly through that, Dinah has this daughter named Asenath. Okay, and the brothers can't stand having Asenath in their presence because it reminds them of their failure to guard their sister, and that their sister was raped by Shechem, so that every time they see this girl Asenath, it reminds them of their failure to take care of their sister Dinah.
They killed all them guys that raped her, didn't they?
Yeah, later on, after the fact,
Yeah.
it was too late. Okay, but their responsibility was to guard the
Yeah.
encampment and to make sure that no women went out on their own, that nobody was placed in jeopardy.
That was pretty serious in those days.
Okay, their responsibility was to protect the camp, and they failed in that responsibility, and they were held accountable for that. And so every time they saw Asenath, they were reminded of their failure.
Oh.
So this is the other theory,
Oh.
is that Asenath was sent away, that Jacob put a chain around her neck, that Asenath is a daughter of Jacob, and she was sent down to Egypt and was adopted by Potiphar and his wife because they couldn't have children.
That's how she ended up in Egypt.
And so she ends up in Egypt, and so she's actually a daughter, a granddaughter of Jacob that marries Joseph, so they keep it in the Jewish family,
Yeah, yeah.
okay?
Yeah, they did.
So there's two theories here. One is that she's a Gentile, she's the daughter of a priest, and she converts to the one true God and becomes a believer in the one true God. The other theory is that she was a believer in the one true God the whole time and that she's Dinah's daughter. So either way you want to take it.
Yeah.
But that's two of the options that they give.
Oh,
But according to the scripture here, it doesn't really specify, but it more appears that she was a Gentile, that she was the daughter of the priest of On, and that when she married Joseph, that she converted to Judaism and became a follower of the one true God.
She was part Jew and part Canaanite though, right? Or what was that?
We don't know 100%.
We don't know
for sure.
100% for sure.
That's what he just
There's,
said.
there's different theories about that. But even if it was the daughter of Dinah, she would be part, because she would be from Shechem and Dinah.
Yeah.
So she would be part from Jacob and part from the people of Shechem.
Yeah,
So she wouldn't be full-blooded
yeah.
Jewish in her genealogy anyway.
Yeah, it wouldn't be like inbreeding so much in.
Right.
Uh,
She would be half and half.
yeah. But these Shechem people now, they were Canaanites, what you
Right.
say? Yeah.
So there you have the two sides.
Always had a lot of problems with them Canaanites.
But that was why they sent that's why they say she was sent down to Egypt, because she wasn't fully
Oh,
Jewish. She was part Jewish and part,
well, that had to have been something supernatural, because what are the odds against that, you know?
yeah.
That had to be something
Yeah.
going on.
And so either way, she has to become a follower of the one true God to be married to Joseph.
Yeah. But how would
Okay,
that
whether
settle-
she was a Gentile or a Jew, she was half and half anyway, right from the start.
You'd think that wouldn't set very well with the Pharaoh.
That's if this Asenath came from there in the first place. She could have just been the daughter of Potiphar and Zuleika, and Joseph married her and she converted.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we're back to Debbie. Okay, Debbie, could you read verse 47 through 55, and we'll be done with chapter 41.
In the 7 plenteous years, the earth brought forth by handfuls, and he gathered up all the food of the 7 years that were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. The food of the field that was round about every city laid he up in the same. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea very much, till he left numbering, for it was without number. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, that Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God, said he, has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second called he Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And the 7 years of plenteousness that were in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, according as Joseph had said. The famine was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, and what he says to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses, and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all countries came to Egypt unto Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all lands.
Okay, so stop there. So this famine, okay, that the Pharaoh dreamed about,
What he says to you, do.
okay, remember Pharaoh had the dream and Joseph interpreted it for the Pharaoh, right? The Lord gave Joseph the interpretation. The famine was not just in Egypt. Okay, it says here,
So in the world, wasn't
there was famine in all the lands. Okay, the whole Middle East was in famine. All the nations of the earth, it says, all the nations of the world. Right? It says in verse 57, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy provisions.
Yeah, I wondered, it said something about, right
The
there.
famine was severe
severe
in
in all the
all the earth.
I thought, well, that's just.
So Joseph actually stored up enough grain during those 7 years of plenty to feed the whole earth during the famine, to preserve life.
Yeah,
Okay, remember, Joseph followed in Jacob's footsteps. Jacob was what? Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. Joseph is about repairing the world. Okay, make everything right, fix everything. Okay? Save everybody, right? Okay, have you ever heard of a land that was in famine, that had food stored up? That if somebody else came from somewhere else, that they would sell them that food? No, we gotta keep it all for ourselves. We wanna make sure we don't run out, right?
they wanted a lot of our food that we got in the granaries.
Right? No, we gotta hoard all this food and keep it for ourselves. We don't wanna die. We gotta make sure we have enough until the famine's over, right?
Yeah, that's true. Human nature. That's-
But no, Joseph opened up the granary, sell the grain to the whole earth.
Yeah.
And why? Because Joseph showed what? Mercy, compassion to all the other nations of the earth. I believe what God did was that as Joseph sold grain
Probably
Out of
kept
the-
multiplying.
out of the granaries, that God just multiplied the grain and kept the granaries full, no matter how much Joseph
Yeah.
sold.
Yeah,
Probably.
that's true. And you know, a lot of that wealth they
Like
gained,
you
that's
showed.
what the Israelites took
Right.
with them when they.
Took with them when they left Egypt, that's how it got there.
They
All
always
the
had a
money-
lot of gold and
All
silver.
the money
They
from
took
the
it all.
world, all the
Yeah.
nations of the world, all the nations of the world come to Egypt to buy bread. And
Yeah.
all the money goes into the treasury in Egypt. And later on, after the captivity in Egypt, the children of Israel walk out with that whole treasury.
They was building a tabernacle, called for a lot of gold,
Mhm.
sheet, and silver.
Yep,
And so they called the people to bring it,
Yep.
and there was more, way more than it is. They
Oh, yeah.
quit bringing it,
Yep.
it's enough. you
and
know.
so he's selling
You're
provisions
hauling that around.
to everybody. But what does the Pharaoh tell the people to do? Whatever Joseph tells you to do, you do. So they're coming to Joseph to buy bread. All the people of Egypt and from all the nations of the world are going to come to Joseph for bread. And Joseph now, of course, has two children, Ephraim and Manasseh, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so now, chapter 42, Angela,
Okay.
you go ahead and read verse 1 through 8.
Jacob perceived that there were provisions in Egypt. So Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you make yourselves conspicuous?" And he said, "Behold, I have heard there are provisions in Egypt. Go down there, purchase us from there, that we may live and not die." So Joseph's brothers, 10 of them, went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Benjamin, Joseph's brother, Jacob did not send along with his brothers, for he said, "Lest disaster befall him." So the sons of Israel came to buy provisions among the arrivals, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph, he was viceroy over the land. He was the provider to all the people of the land. Joseph's brothers came, and they bowed to him, faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers, and he recognized them, but he acted like a stranger toward them, and spoke with them harshly. He said to them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him.
Oh boy,
Dreams come true.
right. And so what happens now, they say in the Midrash, you remember that every nation has customs, right? And remember, Joseph was in charge of the Egyptian military, and he had all the granaries guarded and all the borders of Egypt locked down so that nobody could come into the land of Egypt without him knowing about it. He had to keep track of everything. And they say in the Midrash that Joseph put his son Manasseh in charge of that task, customs along the borders of Egypt, to have everybody that entered into the land had to register at the border.
Yeah.
And so these lists of names were brought to Joseph every day, and the lists were gone through of who had entered the land of Israel. Okay, who had entered the land of Egypt. Okay, and as they entered the land, their names were written in the logs. And eventually, Joseph's 10 brothers appeared on the logs. But what happened was, according to the Midrash, Jacob had told the 10 brothers to enter Egypt from different points. And so the 10 brothers entered Egypt from different places. And so Joseph looks at the lists and he recognizes his brothers. They don't recognize him. And he acts as a stranger and he speaks to them very harshly.
They're still being sneaky.
Yep. So, Elmer, go ahead and read verse 9 through verse 20.
And Joseph remembered the dreams which he dreamed of them, and said to them, "You are spies to seek the nakedness of the land. You have come." And they said to him, "No, kind sir, but to buy food. Are your servants come? We are all one man's son. We are true men. Your servants are no spies." And he said to them, "No, but to see the nakedness of the land you have come." And they said, We your servants are 12 brethren, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is not. And Joseph said to them, "What is that I spoke to you? What is it that I spoke to you, saying, You are spies? Hereby you shall be proved. By the life of Pharaoh you shall not go forth from here, except if your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you, and let him fetch your brother, and you shall be bound, that your words may be proved, whether there is truth in them, or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies." And he put them all together into ward 3 days. And Joseph said to them, the third day, "This do and live, for I fear Elohim. If you are true men, let one of your brethren be bound in your prison house. But go, carry grain for the famine of your houses, and bring your youngest brother to me, so shall your words be verified, and you shall not die." And they did so.
Okay. So what he does, according to the Midrash, they entered through 10 different places into the land of Egypt. And they say that Joseph used this as leverage by saying, you came into the land of Egypt from 10 different places to spy out the whole land of Egypt and find out what our weaknesses are.
That's where they get it from.
And that's where they get that from, is in the Midrash. And so this is Joseph's excuse to call them spies.
Makes sense.
You know, I always thought that his 2 kids were part Egyptian, but according to Midrash, they weren't, right?
Yeah, but that I believe is just the Jewish people trying to cover up what really happened.
They probably they wouldn't like that.
Well, it depends who their mother was too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we go on now. He calls them spies and he wants them to bring their youngest brother, who happens to be Joseph's brother Benjamin, right? So finally, he puts them all in prison. And here's that number 3 again, right? 3 days, he puts them in prison. Some people say that Joseph was in the pit 3 days before the Midianites came and fished him out of the pit. Remember, Yeshua was in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights before he was resurrected. So Joseph puts them in there for 3 days. He brings them out. He says, let one of the brothers stay, and all of the rest of you can go. But your other brother's not going to be released unless you bring your younger brother with you. And this way he's going to prove them. So now his brothers are going to be tested, whether they've repented of their sin of selling Joseph into slavery, or if they're still the same mean, nasty brothers they used to be, right?
Yeah,
Or if they've
yeah,
repented
yeah.
and
When you're,
change their
when you're
ways.
young like that, you do crazy things sometimes. A lot of these guys.
Okay,
they do.
so who are we up to now, Elmer? Okay, Debbie? Okay, verse 21 through verse 28.
And they said one to another, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us. Reuben answered them, saying, didn't I tell you, do not sin against the child? You would not hear. Now his blood is required. And they knew not that Joseph understood them, for he spake unto them by an interpreter. And he turned himself about from them, and wept, and returned to them again, and communed with them, and took from them Simeon, and bound him before their eyes. Then Joseph commanded to fill their sacks with corn, and restore every man's money into his sack, and to give them provision for the way. Thus he did to them. And they loaded their donkeys with the corn, and departed thence. And as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey provender in the inn, he saw his money, behold, it was in his sack's mouth. And he said to his brethren, my money is restored, and lo, it's in my sack. And their heart failed them, and they were afraid, saying one to another, what is this that God has done to us?
Okay.
Usually when you pay something, the money stays gone.
Yep. And this
Never.
they believed was an issue that Joseph would use against them later on when they came back.
Testament.
Right.
It was a test. So now Joseph understood everything, and they say
You knew the language.
what Joseph did was that Joseph used his son Manasseh as the interpreter. And so Joseph would speak to Manasseh in the Egyptian, and then Manasseh would speak to the brothers in Hebrew, and then they translate it back the other way, so they didn't know, so that Joseph wouldn't reveal himself. And he hears them speaking about how they plotted and how they realized that they're going through all of this because of what they did to him. And they take Simeon, because he knows that when Simeon and Levi are together, that's a disaster. And so he takes Simeon prisoner, and basically they say that's because Simeon was the one that said, here comes that dreamer, when he came to approach them back in Dothan. And they said that Levi was the first one to discover the money in his sack, because they had sold, because they sold Joseph. And so they have an issue with money now because they sold Joseph for money. So now they're all concerned about money.
They're afraid, yeah.
See, we sold Joseph for money, and now, here we
You
go.
never get your money back when you buy something.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's the only time
so
we've ever
now-
heard of this.
So now they're really worried, they're scared now.
Yeah.
Like, what's going on? The Lord's judging us now.
Somebody said they stole it or something.
So Angela, could you go ahead and read 29 to the end of the chapter?
They came to Jacob their father in the land of Canaan, and they told him of all that had happened to them, saying, the man, the Lord of the land, spoke harshly to us and considered us as if we were spying out the land. But we said to him, we are truthful men. We have never been spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is gone, and the youngest is now with our father in the land of Canaan. Then the man, the Lord of the land, said to us, by this I will ascertain whether you are truthful people. One of your brothers leave with me, and what is needed for the hunger of your households take and go, and bring your youngest brother to me, so I will know that you are not spies, but truthful people. I will restore your brother to you, and you will be free to circulate about the land. Then, as they were emptying their sacks, behold, every man's bundle of money was in their sack. When they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were terrified. Their father Jacob said to them, I am the one whom you bereaved. Joseph is gone, Simeon is gone, and now you would take away Benjamin? Upon me it has all fallen. Then Reuben told his father, saying, You may slay my 2 sons if I fail to bring him back to you. Put him in my care, and I will return him to you. But he said, My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. Should disaster befall him on the journey which you will take, then you will have brought my hoardiness in sorrow to the grave.
Okay, so now, they come back to Jacob, they all still have their money. Jacob and all of the brothers are terrified now. And on top of this now, Jacob has lost Joseph
Yeah,
and Simeon,
Oh my goodness, yeah.
yeah.
and now they want to take Jacob there.
Third one.
And the third one, and they're both, Joseph and Benjamin are the 2 sons of his favorite wife, Rachel,
Mhm.
right? And so Jacob looks at the brothers and he goes, Rachel died on the road. Joseph went out on the road. Joseph is gone. Simeon went out on the road. Simeon is gone.
Yeah,
Yeah.
If I send Benjamin out on the road, maybe he'll be gone too.
he's like losing his children.
He's losing his children.
Right, yeah.
And here, when Reuben says, I'll be responsible for Benjamin, you can slay my 2 sons if I fail to bring him back. And Jacob looks at Reuben and says, well, what good is that? I already lost 1 son, you want me to lose 2
Yeah.
more?
What would I do that for?
You know, like they're my grandchildren.
Mhm.
They're part of the next generation.
Yeah. He's just showing him how serious he was.
Yeah.
You know? And he says, my son shall not go down with you because his brother is dead. So now they're put in a situation, right? I know. So now they're put in a situation where they have no choice. And they know their father doesn't want to release Benjamin, but they also know that when it gets to the point where they have no food left, either they're all going to die, or Jacob is going to have no choice. He's going to have to send Benjamin whether he likes it or not.
Right.
Down in the corner there.
And so we come to chapter 43, and in the chapter 43, finally Benjamin goes down, and all of the brothers are there. They all bow down before Joseph, the 11 of them. And Benjamin is favored. He's given extra clothes and extra food and presents and things. Joseph tries him, right, by putting the cup in Benjamin's sack so he can test them when he comes back. Joseph wants to test them and see, are they going to sell Benjamin out just like they sold me as a slave?
Right.
Or are they going to be men and protect my brother Benjamin?
The part with the food.
Okay, and that'll come up in the next Torah portion. Okay, basically they're heading on their way back, and one of them has the goblet. Right, they come back, the goblet's found, and they say they're all ready to be slaves, right? To protect Benjamin.
Mhm.
So now Joseph knows that they've repented, that they're willing to protect his brother. And so now Joseph knows that they've truly repented, and now he'll be getting ready to reveal himself to his brothers. That'll be in the next
Yeah.
Torah portion.
Okay.
But this whole Torah portion is really all about Yeshua, because we saw all of the parallels that we spoke about a little while ago between Joseph and Yeshua. We see this time of the year is when these Torah portions about Joseph take place, always during the time of Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication.
That's
We
amazing.
know in John chapter 10, Yeshua celebrated the Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah, and Yeshua is in the name of the Torah portion. So this Torah portion is all about Yeshua. And happy Hanukkah, everybody.
Yeah, happy Hanukkah. Yeah, happy Hanukkah.
Yeah.